You each had an example of the symbol of the white woman as the vulnerable and the pure, and that has certainly come up in our work as we've thought about state-sanctioned violence against the black community, where we saw when, say, Darren Wilson was acquitted, or not even indicted, right, for killing Michael Brown, that there was some inability to respond, right? That's part of what we're thinking about. How do we respond to a social emergency? But for folks who didn't see themselves in that, they weren't a part of the black community, or they didn't know how to relate, white folks here in Boston, like myself, how do we see ourselves in the picture? One of the things that was important for me to understand was that my safety is paramount to the police in Boston. Like, they function to keep white women my age safe. That's like the backdrop.
Welcome to the second program in our spring series here at Old South Meeting House with the ACLU of Massachusetts. The name of the series is The Constitution is for You, a series of conversations. Thanks to the members of both organizations, the ACLU of Massachusetts and Old South Meeting House, for supporting our work. And you can learn more about the ACLU, Old South Meeting House, and our membership programs at the info table. Collaborations and conversations between the ACLU and Old South Meeting House have been many since the ACLU's early days in the 1920s, a period when the Meeting House was struggling with the matter of aligning the organization's policies with First Amendment rights. I'll share a few highlights from that era, noting here that an excellent summary of this timeline is Jonathan Vogel's article on free speech at the Meeting House in the New England Quarterly. In 1925, a gathering of defenders of the right of free speech, led by ACLU founder Roger Baldwin, took place here at the Meeting House. The following year, in 1926, the board of the Meeting House established a more limited policy for public gatherings, including a clause that allowed the board to refuse a gathering that lacked representation by an opposing viewpoint. In late 1929, some of the Meeting House's more conservative board members suggested that a liberal policy for public gathering threatened the building's, quote, stately dignity, end quote. And still later that year, and I believe late November, the Old South Meeting House board voted 29-12 in favor of such a liberal policy, and the policy went into effect in early 1930. This policy is still in effect today, allowing people with opinions that may be unpopular or contentious to gather, speak, and protest within these walls. If we reflect on the nearly 300-year history of public gatherings in this, the largest indoor meeting space in colonial Boston, from protest meetings and memorials after the Boston Massacre to the December 16, 1773 gathering of 5,000 men that led to the Boston Tea Party, I wonder if any ideas of new uses for this building as a springboard for social and political change may emerge from today's discussion on art and change in Boston. With that question in mind, I'm pleased to introduce the members of today's panel. Adam Darrington is a Boston-based public historian who specializes in historical memory and American political culture. As he prepares to graduate with his master's in history from UMass Boston this month, Adam is also busy providing educational programming here at the Meeting House and at other Boston organizations, including the Bostonian Society Old State House and the Boston Athenaeum. Lori Lobenstein is a lifelong activist, an online media specialist, and a longtime youth worker. Today, she holds the position of program design lead at the Dorchester-based Design Studio for Social Intervention, and she's inspired by the vision that new design tools and a greater design awareness will bring new energy and power to her work. ACLU of Massachusetts Political Director Whitney Taylor will bring her knowledge of art history and the intersections of artistic expression and political action to bear as she shares some highlights that bring us from the 18th century to the present day. Whitney will also play the role of discussion moderator, and we're going to, I believe Whitney's going to start us off today. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Hey, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. So, as Erica said, my name is Whitney Taylor. I'm the political director at the ACLU of Massachusetts. And I want to start right now with a little disclaimer. The ACLU is out there in these times and very vocal about the politics and social justice situation in America. And actually, our computers were hacked last night, and my entire presentation is now under, my IT team is working with the fact that malware got infected my computer. Luckily enough, I am the political director of the ACLU and a long lover of art, so I actually pulled art off of my walls in my office and brought it here with me as some examples that I keep near and dear to my heart every day in my office. The ACLU of Massachusetts was founded in 1920. There is some back and forth about this. I am the true believer that we are actually 6 months older than the National ACLU. We were founded here in 1920 on Beacon Hill by a wonderful group of people who decided, you know, we have our Constitution and Bill of Rights, but if there's nobody sitting there defending it, you know, what's the point if it could just be run roughshod over? So when we were founded in 1920, it was very much, you know, the goings-on of Massachusetts and here, the center of Boston. And what I wanted to do was just do a little bit of highlights in the ACLU in our 100-year history of how we have worked with the artistic community in many different ways. One of our first and most prominent cases here in Boston was in 1936 when there was the publication of a book called The Children's Hour, and the city wanted to ban this book because it had lesbian overtones. The ACLU came in and said, no, this is artistic expression, this is freedom of speech, and you can't ban that book. It was one of our first defenses within the artistic community. Over the years, you know, as this history, and I do have to say my slideshow was wonderful, pointing out the long history of art in politics and social movements, and actually it would, you know, it just would have been, I found so many wonderful pieces of art, but I wanted to jump up a little thing that I do have some examples in more modern history. In 2000, here in Massachusetts, believe it or not, tattooing was still illegal. And the ACLU of Massachusetts was brought in because these were artists, tattoo artists, saying our art is being made illegal and only doctors are allowed to do tattoos in Massachusetts. So our legal team went in, and we did not do this lawsuit on freedom of business. We did this lawsuit on freedom of expression and freedom of art, and we won. And in 2000, tattooing was made legal in Massachusetts, and I recently, at the 10th year anniversary, worked with a local tattoo artist out of Salem, and they made this piece for me for the ACLU. This is called Sailor Jerry Artistic Form in Tattooing, and it has a little ACLU banner under there. I personally, one of my favorite pieces from my office. In 2009, artist Shepard Fairey, I have an example of his work here above me here. Shepard Fairey was actually arrested in Boston. Shepard Fairey is a graffiti artist and pretty well known. You might know him from his Obey posters work or his Obama Hope poster. That's Shepard Fairey. And Shepard Fairey came to Boston and was actually arrested for 30 counts of vandalism because he is a public space graffiti artist. The ACLU came in and we were his lawyer for that. We got the vast majority of charges dropped. He had to pay a little bit of a fine, and for, I believe, 10 years, so I think it's almost coming up to an end now, Mr. Fairey was not allowed to carry paint or paint brushes in Boston. That was his probation. thing. So, if any police officer saw him with paint, watch out. But Mr. Ferry is a wonderful activist as well as artist, and he actually designed this piece for the ACLU of Massachusetts that is up here on the screen. And that model, posing as Lady Liberty with her bullhorn, is actually actress Olivia Wilde, who has been very involved in politics and social justice actions and working with Shepard Fairey. So just as the ACLU of Massachusetts, in which we also have a national organization and affiliates in 50 other states, this is some of the work that we have been doing with the artist community as far as defending the rights of artistic expression and social justice and political work through the arts. But what we're here to talk about today, and I'm so excited to be here with Lori and Adam. It's going to be so wonderful hearing about the history of art and activism in Boston from our very beginning, and then hearing modern day what our artistic community here is doing. But I just wanted to talk about, for a quick second before going over to them, why art? Art is motivation. Art is essential for social change. And I'm loath doing this, but I really want to read this piece because it's so important. And I think it really kind of captures what we're trying to talk about here today. For change to happen, people need a sense of possibility to fuel their motivation. Art provides us a vision of what could be, as well as a critical reflection upon the world we must act within right now. Art also helps us feel and experience both pain and possibility. And methods of, and in a word, art moves us. Yet, with all this sound and all this fury being directed out in the world now, being seen in art, the tactics and strategies of activism offer us the tools and methods to turn artistic effort into political effort. And this was a beautiful piece, that quote that I found, and I just wanted to talk about, first of all, just the essence of change and why art is there as such a motivator to the masses. Another main point that I want us to think about as we're talking today is access to art. There's been quite a history, and you will see the history of art and activism. And some of the greats in art, Pablo Picasso, Edward Degas, some of these fine arts masters that we know about, they were political in their time. Their art does point to political social activism work. But at the same time, in fine arts, what is the access to that art? Only certain people have access to galleries and show openings. It is not public square work. So we need to talk about, and we're going to be looking at the different types of art, from fine arts to and activism there, but more even so to accessible art by the public, poster art. This is one of my favorite pieces that I just bought recently from a young artist out of London, talking about her feelings about Donald Trump. And I love this piece. It's it's taking something, it's talking about feminism, but it's a pink happy elephant to bring everybody in, to go, what is this also saying? And it's also saying, I just want to be equal, because I'm a feminist. So this is accessible poster art that can be out there, easily reproduced, easily consumed by the masses. And art is an equalizer. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter what community you come from. You can always interact with art. And as a great equalizer, I think that's another point that we need to talk about, the importance of art. Art in branding and creating a narrative, which is something that is very important. Some of my other work that I love is something that people will probably recognize, Reefer Madness, the earliest parts of the war on drugs here in the United States. There's a whole series, and I have several of them myself, Assassin of Youth, Marijuana, a puff, a party, a tragedy. This was easily accessible. This was propaganda art coming out of the US government to promote our war on drugs. And you had whole communities of people thinking truly that just a little bit of use of marijuana was going to lead to somebody losing their entire lives. And especially it's always the wonderful point of, especially women cannot control themselves while using marijuana, so we need to make sure that marijuana is illegal to protect the ladies. I love it when stuff's done in our name as women. And another more piece on talking about branding and actually coming from the community, the women's suffrage movement did an amazing job of using arts, easily accessible art, and branding. The suffragette movement actually created a color scheme that then women and suffragette supporters could use. They could use it as just wearing the 3 colors if they didn't want to be out loud and in your face about their suffragette leanings. Or there was big, huge posters and sashes and buttons that people who were part of this political movement could wear. And one of the things that I love was when they thought about this color and this branding of what they did. And Votes for Women was they wore purple for loyalty and dignity, they wore white for purity, and green for hope. So you can look throughout suffragette art and see these colors repeated again. Once again, using branding and visuals to do that work. And then finally, I wanted to just mention quickly global inspiration. And this is very hard to do without speaking, but I highly recommend to anybody that is interested to look at a new series on Netflix called Patriot Act by a young man named Hassan Minhaj. He did this wonderful piece called Hip Hop and Streaming. And one of the points that he came out in this modern world of the internet, and especially hip hop, was the fact that there has been a recent piece by an artist here in the US called Childish Gambino. He did, I don't know if you said, This Is America, talking about racism in America. Well, we have now seen there is a project in Thailand called Rap Against Dictatorship. These are young men, young rappers in Thailand who literally have to cover their faces because their rap would get them not only arrested but possibly executed. But they said they looked to Childish Gambino's, This Is America video, and that song that he did as an inspiration to them to do this rap against this dictatorship in Thailand. So art is an equalizer, it brings our community together, and it's a wonderful thing overall. And Boston has a history. And that's what I'm so excited to now move to Adam and Lori to talk about history of art and then modern day Boston.
Sure. So thank you very much, Whitney. You reminded me. I've been getting the push emails in my inbox about your membership for the ACLU is almost up to due, so you better pay up. So I know I have to go now after sitting on the panel here with you to actually continue to support the great work that the ACLU does. And as a historian, as a public historian, something that's really, really important to me is the ways in which historical content and the professionals who are invested in this work can really use the history, use the past in a way that helps us reflect on where we are today and maybe helps us figure out, paths to advancing social justice. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about the work I do. But I was brought on today to talk about 18th century art and social change in Boston, which I'll do. And for the most of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about the Boston Massacre print by Paul Revere, a really iconic image of 18th century Boston and a very influential piece of art that has been iterated on since 1770 when the Boston Massacre happens. And if there's any sort of takeaway that I'd like people to walk away with is just to note that historical moments like the massacre are constantly being reinterpreted and reused and reappropriated for different times, for different reasons. And it's a really important component of why the past continues to be relevant to us, is because we can draw lessons from it and continue to contextualize where we are. And the massacre is certainly an example of that. So before we get to the massacre, there's some other things that are going on in the 18th century in terms of art here in Boston and Massachusetts, especially in this really frantic period in the 1760s and 1770s as discussions and debates about what Boston's colonial relationship with Great Britain, with London, with the King, with Parliament is going to look like. So I just wanted to talk about a few of those quickly before I get into them really. So I wanted to first show you this. which is an image of Mary Rowlandson and her capture in 1675. Now, in 1675, English colonists were engaged in a war with Metacom, or otherwise known as King Philip. It was really this last moment of effective native military resistance to English settlement, English colonization here in New England. And her narrative of being a person who gets captured by indigenous peoples became this sort of really big hit. She writes an account of her journey here. But this image right here comes from the 1773 edition of her story, which, if you look onto the right, so she's standing on the left, holding her gun, fighting off her captors, but on the right are the captors. And this is what's really neat about the image here, is that the captors are depicted here sort of looking more as British soldiers and redcoats and white men, rather than sort of native people. So that's one of the things that historians have read into the image here. So one of the things that's really neat is thinking about ways in which colonial Bostonians were appropriating and using the imagery of native peoples in order to protest against British action in regards to the colonies. And one of the other big pieces of popular culture that deserves to be talked about is political cartoons. They're hugely influential in this period of time. And obviously until today, I mean, you know, we all pop on Twitter every now and then. We always see new political cartoons out there. And so the 1770s had their version. One of the most striking ones is this one. So The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drought, from 1774. So in the period, colonial Bostonians are really protesting what we refer to as the Intolerable Acts, a series of British parliamentary laws that continue to restrict American colonial trade and sort of punish colonists for their protest and for their desires to be represented before they're taxed. In this one here, if you take a really good look at the woman in the center of the image here, she's depicted in native dress. This is supposed to be Boston or Massachusetts or the colonies. And she's sort of being assaulted, and tea is being dumped down her throat in this really forceful manner. And again, you talked a little bit about the use of women in reefer madness in the 20th century, right? But there's also these other connections of the representations and idealizations of women have always played a role in defining ways in which, by violating women, right, you can consider something, that violation, to be worse than just violating the rest of the population, since these women have such a complicated social idealization and definition in the period. So that's just political cartoons that are pretty interesting and relevant. But what I really wanted to talk about was this, the Boston Massacre print by Paul Revere. Now, the massacre is this really formative moment in Massachusetts history, and it happens on March 5th, 1770. So right up the street from where we are, actually, a group of Bostonians gathers in front of what was then the townhouse of Boston. They're confronted by a group of British soldiers, and eventually, after some serious argumentation between them, the British soldiers open fire into the crowd. Now, when the smoke clears and days pass, it takes 10 days for the final victim to die, but in total 5 colonists are going to be killed in front of the townhouse here. This is a watershed moment for people in town in the 1770s who were agitating against certain forms of the way in which Great Britain was ruling over Boston. In particular, this is a huge moment for the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams, James Otis Jr., and also Paul Revere, who is sort of along that same political line. And by the end of March, Paul Revere has already made this sort of really formative image that lasts in American consciousness. It's in every American history book. I mean, everybody sort of looked at the image at one point or another. And the fun fact is that Paul Revere wasn't the first guy to do the actual image. He knew a guy named Henry Pelham, and he took the idea, made a couple alterations, and published it before Henry Pelham got to it, which is another part of what's amazing about American art is like, oh, you take other ideas from other people and then you print them under your own name, and there you go, it's an American story. But here, Paul Revere, has made this effective image that really demonizes British action and glorifies colonial responses and colonial resistance. And this happens all before, this becomes really popular, all before the trial of the soldiers happens in the end of 1770, in October, November, and through December. And so what's really neat about this, and I want to take a couple close looks here and see, we're actually going to read some of this. So this is a really up-close shot of the soldiers themselves. Captain Preston is the back ordering the troops to fire. And it looks kind of like a firing squad. Now, when I use this image and talk with people who are visiting Boston on the Freedom Trail, one of the neat things that people seem to read into it sometimes is the ways in which it still resonates for us today. Because essentially these are, people have read in incidents of violence like the Kent State Massacre. They've read in police brutality moments that we have in our own sort of immediate case here of people being killed in the streets. So this is sort of ways in which these kinds of moments could be read in through imagery here. And Paul Revere is depicting these men, obviously, as being complicit in the murder of the men they shoot. Obviously, because Captain Preston is behind, he's giving them the order to fire. They're standing in proper position, firing into the crowd. But he does another thing, too. Paul Revere is this great propagandist. Above the soldiers, right at the top of the image, in front of the Customs House, it says Butcher's Hall, okay? So these men are essentially butchers. So he's using some wordplay here. And then I also want to take a look at the colonists over here who are doing the dying in this image. They're the massacre victims. Now, their depiction is pretty interesting, mainly because of a couple things going on here. So the people are obviously, some of them are being killed, they're bleeding out and being carried away, some of them. But you don't see any weapons or people fighting back or resisting. Now, in the moment, what we do know from historical research is that, in fact, this crowd was a mob. They were gathered. Many had some sabers. Many had clubs. They were rope makers. So there were people who were angry and agitated out there and were apparently throwing things at the soldiers. And so this isn't really a peaceful crowd. But you're supposed to read into these colonists of Boston, these Sons of Liberty, right? But for years, in resisting British taxation policy, people in town had been, tarring and feathering customs officials. They were destroying people's personal property, boats and homes. So there is some violence going on there, and it's a way of clearing these people of that sort of onus, the moral responsibility for their violent actions. While there was a ton of peaceful protest, there's also this sort of moment of violent protest from the Sons of Liberty here. And so what I really wanted to show here was the way it changed over time. The Boston Massacre in 1770 is depicted by Paul Revere, and if you didn't notice here, Crispus Attuck, the man who dies first, he was Wampanoag and of African descent. He was an enslaved man here in Framingham, and he's in the moment living in town under a fake name, evading the law, self-liberated himself, and is living here. And he's not depicted in the Paul Revere version. But his narrative gets recaptured, actually, through this reinterpretation in the antebellum period. And this is one of the images. This is from 1856. And this really demonstrates the ways in which his narrative is sort of brought back into the discussion here, especially by black Bostonians who push the narrative of black relationships with the American state, and as an example of Crispus, what a black person would do for a nation that continues to oppress him and treats him, in such egregious and outrageous ways. And this is in the height of tensions in the states between abolitionist forces and pro-slavery forces throughout the nation right before the American Civil War, right after Bleeding Kansas and before John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. But then it also gets another interesting reinterpretation here. This you can see this if you walk up to Boston Common today. This is another one built in 1888 of a statue. And this one actually represents Crispus in the actual image. I know it's hard to see a little bit, but he's engraved there at the bottom. But one of the also neat things that it does is the lady above, this sort of symbol of freedom. Apparently her name is Free America, and she's holding chains, broken chains in her hands. And crushing a British crown. So emphasizing liberty, freedom, and this continuity between colonial struggles for freedom and abolition in this period in the 1880s when abolitions and the Civil War's gains in terms of civil rights are being rolled back in the South through the resurgence of white supremacy and the creation of Jim Crow. But Bostonians are continually reinterpreting this history and using this piece of art in ways to celebrate, commemorate, and continue to question, what the meaning of this event in 1770 and March 5th is going to mean. So it's pretty neat, and one of the ways in which art continues to be relevant in many circumstances. So that's just one really great example of how art is meaningful in terms of thinking about Boston and social change. But I know that we also have some other things to talk about too. So I'm ready to move on there. So.
Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was amazing, and I know I've listed a bunch of questions to come back to you after,
Sure.
but so there's kind of the beginning, the building of Boston, and how art was used there, and now we get to turn to Lori and the use of art and social activism today in modern day Boston.
Thank you. I want to talk some about the ways that we've thought about the design studio for social intervention. We began about 2015, and myself and my co-founder, Kenneth Bailey, we both came with a background in social justice work, not with a background in design, but we were starting to realize that there were these spaces called design studios where the for-profit sector were able to imagine really amazing new products that might meet new needs or create new possibilities. Meanwhile, those of us doing social justice work, we were still marching on Washington, we were still creating youth programs, we were still unionizing and boycotting, and we have some really good forms for creating change, and yet those forms weren't moving along, and we felt like we didn't really have some of the tools for imagining new forms, and yet the folks who were taking on the hardest impact of injustice were being expected to imagine solutions to really complex problems. Right here in Boston right now, we still have violence against communities of color. We still have intense gentrification pressures. We still have, issues with joblessness, homelessness, opioid abuse. These are very complex social problems, and yet we don't have the tools and the resources to say, how do we solve a problem like this? So we wanted to create a space to think with artists, to think with academics, to think with activists and residents and community members. How do we solve some of these problems? And so we've been doing that work and really looking towards artists, not just in terms of the amazing ways that they energize us with music, with signs, with artwork, but also to say, how do they frame problems? How do they take on problems in different ways? How do they make some of the things that we take for granted, some of the arrangements of day-to-day life, and how do they make that strange in a way that might help us come to a new framing of a problem or a new solution for a problem? And I also think that they have some real nuance in terms of the symbolic. Is that better? All right. Thinking about how artists use the symbolic, and I think about in this context, in this setting right here, when we walk it all the way back to the Boston Tea Party, right? It was such an elegant gesture. It was so clear, right? Taking our anger about British power, about the tax on tea, and throwing tea into the water. And, it was like everyone understood that gesture. That was a gesture that we could all get together around. So we think now, like when we march, or we're on strike, we're picketing, this isn't a gesture that's related to the content of what we're trying to address. So what are gestures that we might work on with artists that would be more directly related to the content we're trying to address? And so I want to use one example as we've continued to think about some of the problems that have come all the way through our Constitution into present times. We were thinking about state-sanctioned violence against the Black community. We were thinking about how each time a Black person was killed by police or vigilantes, the community had to go through grieving, had to go through protest, and it felt like each time we had to respond as if it was an individual issue, when we knew that it was actually occurring and reoccurring and occurring and reoccurring. So for us, we started to think about what if we could frame this as a social emergency. This was something that we have emergency procedures for other things. We have emergency procedures for fires. We have emergency procedures for earthquakes. We have emergency procedures, those of us who fly a lot, we know that the flight attendant is going to say this mask is going to drop down, you got to put yours on first before you put on, So we know how to recognize a stroke because of the emergency procedures we've learned there, but we're missing emergency procedures for the social emergency, so we don't know how to respond. And so we put out a call to artists and activists to say, what might those emergency procedures be? And as we started to hear from them, everything from collective dinners to a community-based group that was bringing people together around collective education, they said, we want more of a frame here. So what we decided was One of the things that our emergency procedures are based in is infrastructure. Not only do we know to stop, drop, and roll, but we have fire extinguishers and we have fire escapes. So we needed to imagine with artists, activists, residents, what would that social emergency response center be? How would we have a space like an emergency response center that would help us deal with a social emergency? And so I want to frame this, we have a short video from when we first did this. The first Cirque, as we called it for short, the first social emergency response center happened in the 2 weekends following the Trump inauguration. But it had been planned all the way through that fall as artists and activists really poured out, longing for a way to respond, already heading to the airports for the Muslim ban, already heading to the streets and planning the Women's March. But what were some other ways that they could respond and be in community together? So that's all I'll say. We'll show the video and then I'll talk a little bit more about the role of artists. The horrifying Trump win underscores the fact that we're all living in a social emergency, even if it affects each of us differently. In other kinds of emergencies like earthquakes or tsunamis, hurricanes, there's emergency response centers to help coordinate food, shelter, information. So we felt like we needed a social emergency response center to take on the real and pressing social emergencies that we are facing right now.
We're creating a space where people can come in and express how they're feeling and then pivot into collective action. By the time people leave, we want them to be able to express what they're doing.
With Trump trying to dangerously narrow the definition of what it means to be an American, Cirques are places where you can bring your whole damn self. We welcome everyone, from frontline activists to local neighbors, artists, healers, children, and concerned allies. The Cirque is a place where folks can feed their mind, body, and spirit. Cirques include creative action, healing, collective art making, cooking, performances, and more. In emergencies, we need information. The plotting room includes our political workshops, our radical library, and interactive ways of reimagining this work. We're figuring out how we're tracking this storm and how we're reconstructing democracy after it.
Cirques help us recognize we're in a social emergency. They're an orientation space. They help us move from despair, rage, and hopelessness into collective, radical action.
It's ended up being in a space where there's actually room for exchange and you can actually see the change happening.
I've made connections with people that outside of the space I don't know if I would cross paths with some of the people that I've met today.
The Cirque is an idea of bringing people together to reflect of what is happening and giving us a space to then reflect how can we organize what we should do it, and I think that is an idea that's going to spread.
Boston was just the beginning. Communities around the country are beginning to plan their own social emergency response centers.
Want to join us? Contact us at cirque@ds4si.org and we'll send you a Cirque kit to help you get started.
That's awesome.
And indeed, Cirques did pop up around the country, as well as quite a few here in Boston, done at churches, done at high schools, done at colleges, all different kinds of settings, done in the streets. But I think getting back to, what artists can bring to this kind of social justice work, and you touched on it as well, this ability to create spaces that embody what we're fighting for. And we felt since this uptick in aggression and repression from the current administration, that even as we fight back, that constant energy of fighting is exhausting and is not always possible. We even can't be in a constant social emergency, right? We're humans, we have to go about our business, but also we have to go about generating spaces that have new atmospheres, right? Whether it's the Cirque, where you're suddenly in a space where you might have come for a political conversation, but now you're in a high energy dance class, or you're making buttons with your kid. How do we create spaces where we do have these new atmospheres and we start to create possibilities for what we're fighting for, where we can really embody it and be open to what that feels like and what energy that brings to this ongoing work. So we really have felt that kind of leadership from the artistic community, both in terms of finding metaphors with us, in terms of creating these kinds of spaces, in terms of showing in public. We still need to march, we still need to protest, but what else can we do in public that maybe some folks who don't feel safe marching, some folks who are already under attack, just going about their business, what are spaces that could help them step into this work, but also help them step into what are we fighting for and what's possible and what's different if we are reconstructing democracy, to use that metaphor. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's amazing. And I figured what we could do now is, I don't know if I have some questions, but I thought maybe we could do either of you have questions for the other two of us that we could start with, just going a little kind of question and answer amongst ourselves?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to know, part of what the ACLU does, is been so inspiring. So, what keeps the professionals? Because as historical professionals, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but there's, sometimes there's a lot of burnout, especially when people are trying to be sort of conscious about what's going on in our country and around the world, and on so many different issues. I think you see everybody feels some sort of burnout from these things. Is there anything, what do you sort of cling on to at the ACLU, maybe just in your own experience or the experience of the people you work with, and what keeps you going in making sure that we're able to create social change?
Thank you. That's a great question, and actually, it is taking this work to a more personal place. And through art and seeing these wonderful things, like I'm now excited to set up an emergency center for ACLU staff, where we could go and do this work, because it is a period of time. The ACLU being 100 years old, we've had a very big bump in people being interested in what we do during the current administration. But we've been around for 100 years and fighting all the other administrations as well. So I think one of the big things is to really recognize, at least from my perspective, that we are an enterprise that will continue existing regardless. The Constitution will always be there at some point, as long as we have this democracy, this grand experiment that we're still in. And so I think recognizing, like I do a lot of work on enterprise health and making sure that the organization can last. But the real thing that I always do is we kind of talk about freedom can be fun, and bringing in especially for me, art and music, and working with young people, working with local folks, meeting people where they are in their life, and how we can bring social activism and the Constitution to them. I actually have a piece that I didn't talk of here. In 2016, we worked with a local artist, Iraq Arroyo. He's a photographer, and we put together the show called Inside Out. And what this show looked at were people from our Dorchester community who got wrapped up in the criminal justice system as young people, and then have been incarcerated and come out the other end. And guess what? Coming back, living in our communities. And so we actually did we did a big, huge exhibit. We did a launch party in a Black-owned space in Dorchester. And we celebrated the artists, we celebrated the people of putting together this, that when people are talking about being tough on crime and those bad people that are coming over our borders, or those criminals, all the horrible rhetoric that is out there in our community about our neighbors, reminding them, no, they're actually our neighbors, and they are here, and they're wonderful people, and if you hear their stories, you would go, well, no wonder you got caught in that cycle. because there weren't these other opportunities from the communities that you're coming out in. So I think finding ways of doing the work and being fun, making sure we do self-care. And I think, one of the wonderful things, as Lori was talking about in the work in the program that you do, is understanding of people as a whole and bringing people together as a whole. So I appreciate that awesome softball question about the ACLU. But it is something that I think we all need to take care of, not just folks that work in this all the time, because as I said, the democracy is a grand experiment, and it's difficult. And it's hard, and I think that's one of the things that we didn't tell everybody for many, many years, for probably a century, that it's not just about voting on one day. It's about being involved all the time, and that's tough work. So thank you for that question.
I have a comment. I don't know if it's even a question. I thought we could think about it together.
Yes.
You each had an example of the symbol of the white woman as the vulnerable and the pure. And that has certainly come up in our work as we've thought about state-sanctioned violence against the black community, where we saw when, say, Darren Wilson was acquitted, or not even indicted, right, for killing Michael Brown, that there was some inability to respond, right? That's part of what we were thinking about. How do we respond to a social emergency? But for folks who didn't see themselves in that, they weren't a part of the black community, or they didn't know how to relate, white folks here in Boston, like myself, how do we see ourselves in the picture? One of the things that was important for me to understand was that my safety is paramount to the police in Boston. Like, they function to keep white women my age safe. That's like the backdrop. And we've seen that backdrop since, the white woman in the awful drought and the white woman in Reefer Madness, right? So I think as we think about social justice, and even as we choose symbols, like white as purity, for the suffrage movement, like that's very problematic. That's part of this symbolism that has also meant that if you're not white, you're not pure, and you are the problem, and you're endangering whiteness. And I wonder then, like, how do we either question that kind of symbolism or use it in a way that makes it strange and starts to point to these relationships between me getting to go about my business and some of these folks getting locked up or killed?
Well, I had a thought on that in a historical context, which is thinking about the sort of the distinctions and the divides that come between different communities that are interested in all forms of social justice. I think with the example that I gave with colonial Boston and the Sons of Liberty, they desired particular ends to their actions, right? It's about political rights, and they could delineate exactly what they were struggling for, right? And that may have come in conflict with a lot of other things that are going on for people who are also in search of these other forms of social justice. And I think particularly one of the things I think about a lot is enslaved life here in Massachusetts in the colonial period. At the same time, Sam Adams is talking about, and the Sons of Liberty and others are talking about the great idealism of the American Revolution, of the emerging American consciousness and identity. What did that mean, and who is it for, right? Who was representation for, who was self-government for, and who was it not for? Even though there may have been these natural allies you have in these struggles. The same thing goes with, I think, suffrage and abolition. Famous divides between abolitionists and suffragists along the lines of, like, what is politically realistic for us to do in any moment in 1850 or 1870 or 1890 or in the 19-teens. Huge divides between the greats of these stories and leaders there. And one of the things that I think, thinking about how we can get over these things, is one of the really unique things that I've seen in terms of activists in my generation is thinking more about ways in which intersectionality plays into what we're doing, and thinking about the complicated parts of our identities that all matter in trying to create a sustainable and sufficient social change. So I think one of the things that is good about what we're doing now is thinking more about intersectionality in ways that unfortunately went by the wayside for one reason or another in the sort of historical relationships we've had between different kinds of activists struggling for what they think that society should give them and owes them, in fact. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about that. Thanks.
Definitely, and I think adding to that, just the use of art in propaganda and in politics. This wasn't, I think all of us are gravitating toward art as in social justice and kind of the people against oppressive, either governments or communities or situations, whatever you want to say. But you know, the fact is art from the very beginning is used as a manipulator of the general public, right? And what they figured out is going back into people's deep psyches of, you know, once again, white women being something we need to protect. So that what a wonderful symbol to be out there if somebody's against them. You know, that's the way that we can portray it. You know, very early as before the modern war on drugs was built in the early 20th century, you know, the New York Times had literally a cover story on black men who were who could not be killed by bullets, going after and raping white women. And so this was post-slavery, but how and trying to integrate black folks and especially black men into our society and our things. This was about labor disputes. We all of a sudden had all of this cheaper labor out there. And what did we need to do? What did the white male power structure have to do? It had to make black men scarier so that they wouldn't be an issue in labor relations. In 1914, one of the first actual laws on the books for drugs was Chinese men could not smoke opium in San Francisco because they were going to rape white women, when in fact white women could continue using opium and actually order it from the Sears catalog. So I think first off is recognizing that we have been a prop for a very long time. I think it's very important if folks, you notice that I am not shy about talking about structural racism and that this country was based on, and structural sexism that this country was built on, and that first and foremost, I think white women need to stand up and say, not in my name, stop doing this. I love like this young female artist that I said from London. She didn't put a picture of a woman here. She put a pink elephant. You know, so trying to get away from color, trying to get away from an obviously identifiable gender, but talking about feminism in a broader sense, because we all should be feminists as far as I'm concerned. And so I think standing up and recognizing that those of us who have historically enjoyed privilege, so starting with white men and white women, you know, we can then argue where white women go, and then, you know, people of color, and then, you know, women of color, you know, or who we need to stand up for. But as Lori said, we cannot put it on those communities to be the voice. We need to stand up. Those of us with privilege need to use our privilege and do this, whether it's through art, or whether it's through talking about art, or doing other types of work. You know, I wish I could be an artist. I am not talented. That's why I talk about art. I had a quick question. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Well,
There's another question.
We should be wrapping it up. Can you do a quick question and then just keep it to a short
So why don't we
version?
do a quick question and we can all wrap up on it. So what I wanted to ask both of you is, how do you bring young people and engage them into your work? Because this is, I think, once again, art is a great equalizer. This is a way that we can easily speak across generations as well as across communities. So is there anything in either of your work talking about reaching out to youth?
We did the Youth Activism Design Institute for 4 summers, working with young people in Boston around an issue that they brought to us, which was what they called youth violence, and we reframed as social violence amongst youth, and really thinking with them about some new ways to address it, including we worked with an artist who helped us think about affect, and thinking about the affect in neighborhoods that had been hard hit by violence and what that meant for young people, where they were viewed with suspicion, they viewed each other with suspicion, they were highly controlled, and some of that horizontal violence was actually a result of the vertical violence coming down within school context, within community context, police context. So we designed big urban games. We used childhood games and we played them at the scale of the neighborhood or the block or across the street. Games like Foursquare and Tug of War, and we just did them like Tug of War in Upham's Corner, from the island on Columbia Road. When there was a walk signal, suddenly we were playing tug of war, and cars were stopping, and people were jumping in for whichever side was losing, and people were taking pictures. And for the young people, they couldn't believe that this was happening in a community that had felt so fractured. And the other thing that was interesting, because some of the young people were activists, they didn't understand why it was important until the police told them to stop. And they said, no, we're not stopping.
I think one of the things I'll say is I think the really important work is being done in the community, and out in these communities where the need is felt in the most real terms. But in thinking about what historians do, I can't speak for the whole profession, but what's been really inspiring about learning about what has happened in the past and what is going on now with historical professionals thinking about historic sites and museums and public history is that there is a growing consciousness and awareness about meeting people where they are. Often American history has been presented in, a old dead white man kind of way, and actually transforming and thinking about these stories and narratives, being honest about them, and thinking about representation, thinking about open dialogue and discussion, knowing that we aren't the arbiters of truth, but rather people who are seeking discussion and dialogue just as much with our audiences as we are from the historical documents and the texts. I think there's been a big push amongst historical professionals to really get, our stories and how they reflect on what we're doing now and what matters in the moment, and how they can help us think about where we are and where we're going. I really think that's been a really big struggle for historical professionals. It hasn't always been easy, but historical professionals and public historians have really done a great job of reaching out in some ways. We've seen a lot of new stuff happen in the last few years, like the creation of a National African American Historic Cultural Museum in Washington, D.C., the new Smithsonian Museum. We've seen the Lynching Museum in Alabama. And we see things here too in New England. In particular, we see the Harriet Beecher Stowe House does some amazing work on dialogue and contributions, and even too here locally in Boston, we're talking a lot about these issues. I think every site on the Freedom Trail has thought more about Black representation, about representation of women, and what stories we can take from these communities. So I think there's been a lot of really good work and a lot left to do, but and maybe there haven't been, not that there's excuses for the past, but I think people have really been kicked into gear by local activists more than anything else, and really trying to get to what these communities have been telling us for so long that we've ignored. So I think there's been some real progress on that end, and that also helps get in young people through the door, I think, for sure. So a lot of work on that and being more intersectional about what we're talking about, the narratives we speak about and display for people.
Thank you both so much for coming and being part of this. I think that all of our groups together, we can continue working together and bringing this art. I think this is the beginning of more art and social activism that we can do together in Boston. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.